Would you like to get started?
Thanks, Lou, and kia ora koutou katoa. Nice to see you all, or not your faces necessarily, but yeah, it's great to have these talks, and good that they're going to be recorded as well for other people to see who might not have been able to come. So yeah, my name's Philippa Jamieson, and I may know many of you, and you may have known me as the former editor of Organics magazine for 13 years. But I just thought I'd give a wee bit of background about me and like relevant to the GE topic that I'm going to be talking about. And really, I was thinking about it, and my understanding of not just genetic engineering, but about it goes back to in the 1980s. There was a whole thing about plant variety rights. Now, this is basically companies or people developing plants, and this is pre-GE, but developing plants and then wanting to patent them, to own the rights to that kind of plant because they tweak something, whatever, through not GE breeding at that point. And I watched a film, a New Zealand film, as it turned out, although I wasn't actually aware when I watched The Neglected Miracle that it was a New Zealand film by Māori filmmaker Barry Barclay. And it came out in the about mid-80s, I think. And that was all about plant variety rights, and Barry and his team travelled all around the world to about, I don't know, 10 different countries in Europe and Central America and various places. Looking at, it was really a kind of an overview of the food system and how, and the corporatization of food, the commoditization of food, you know, comparing, for example, these monoculture wheat crops in the US that was just like one variety of wheat, you know, as far as the eye could see, and then comparing that with old school wheat growing in Greece, I think it was, where they had something like 12 varieties of wheat that they were growing either in neighbouring fields or, you know, it might have been different farmers grew different varieties, but they're all within Kui. And, you know, if one variety got a disease or pest or something, there was enough biodiversity that you wouldn't lose everything. So, yeah, and so that looking right back to that whole plant variety rights and the commoditization of food is what started getting me thinking about you know, how our food is grown, what kind of food we support. It's not just about going and buying any old food. It's like, well, how is it grown? What impact did it have on the environment, on the social, you know, system and, you know, fair trade and all of that. And then, so then I started getting into organics and composting and realizing about, you know, the effects on ecosystems of you know, agrochemicals and how, you know, you had to think holistically. You couldn't just, you know, think, oh yeah, I'll spray Roundup to get rid of these weeds and that'll be that. You had to think, well, what else is this affecting? What effect does it have on the soil microbes? What does it have effect on the soil consistency and acidity or whatever? So it's just, I developed much more of a holistic sort of mindset. And then, so going through the 90s, I kind of, you know, I got really into organic food and the nutrition component was really, really important, the nutrition and health. Just not only not having pesticide residues, but also on the positive, you know, growing things in an organic way meant that the plants could more easily take up minerals and so on from the soil, and therefore they were, there in better amounts for us, and they were more bioavailable and all of that. So then we came to the GE, sort of late 90s, I started, or even mid 90s, I started to become aware of GE as something, and I was reading about it in, the forerunner of Organic NZ magazines, which was called Soil and Health, published by the Soil and Health Association, same magazine essentially. I started reading more about GE, and I thought, well, that's the mindset of trying to tweak genes, at that, in the lab, at that very tiny level. You think, okay, we're going to make this tweak here and get something good, maybe. But then it's like, well, what effect does it have on the whole? So I was already thinking about that. And then, of course, the Greens, the Green Party got into Parliament under their own, without the alliance, under their own steam in 1999. And Jeanette Fitzsimons was, instrumental in, and the Greens were, in pushing for this moratorium on growing GE crops in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And that, there was just a huge GE-free movement around that time, around the turn of the century then. And I became part of that, and I learned lots of things. And I'm not a scientist, but I try to read and understand the science. But of course, GE isn't just about science. It's about the environment, ecosystems, about the social milieu, about, cultural considerations, philosophy, ethics, all of these things. So you can't just silo it and say, oh, it's a scientific issue. I feel like I'm speaking to the converted possibly here. I don't know. I recognise a few of you, and I'm sure a lot of you have been involved in the whole GE free movement over many years. So I'm just going to say, if you want to put any questions in the chat as we go, please do. And Lou, if you can maybe keep an eye. If there's anything relevant, like, I'm happy to answer as we go along. So where was I? Okay, just a quick bit about the terminology. And you're probably all aware of this, but I prefer to use the term genetic engineering, because that's really specific. It's about tweaking genes in the lab. And I find that quite a sort of precise and accurate term. The term that I guess is mostly used across the board is genetic modification. But the thing about that term is it can be used in quite a vague way. You get people saying, oh, we've been, genetically modifying plants and animals for centuries or millennia. And they don't mean genetic engineering in the lab. They mean, of course, selective breeding. And that's not genetic engineering. That's not what we're talking about. So, yeah, there is a bit of sometimes it's used, I think, disingenuously by, proponents of GE who want it to sound like, oh, we've been doing this stuff for years. So that's why I sort of, I prefer genetic engineering. Gene editing, now that gene editing is a subset of GE. Gene editing refers to the newer techniques of genetic engineering that have been around for about 10, 12 years, maybe. And they are more precise in that scientists know more now about the functions of different genes within various species. They can pinpoint, let's say, what makes a primrose yellow, or they can pinpoint certain genes and say that we know this has that function. And so they can use these little genetic scissors, if you like, or it's usually involving an enzyme of some kind that goes in and either deletes a particular gene, or it could add genetic material. But the thing is, with all the knowledge we have so far, they still do not know and cannot predict how that genome will repair itself. So that's huge. I mean, there can be changes, the unexpected changes, unforeseen changes, not just at the cut site, that precise little area that they're going in and tweaking, but completely randomly, seemingly, at somewhere else in the genome. So, you know, the myth that GE is precise is, you know, you have to say, okay, well, which bit is precise? Yes, we've got a little bit more knowledge about some of it, but actually we have, you know, still next to no knowledge about a lot of the functions and the repair systems and the what do you call it, the whole way that the DNA operates as a whole. So again, that's, you know, coming back to that holistic thinking. To me, GE comes from a mindset, a silver bullet mindset, a very siloed, narrow mindset of, we're going to go in and we're going to tweak this little gene and then it's going to have this effect. Not thinking about all these other considerations. So that is one of the prime reasons that I'm, you know, I think we need to be incredibly cautious about this technology. Now, I haven't got the study in front of me, but someone may know there was a study that was done on mice, where mice genes were subject to some kind of gene editing. And there was something like, from memory, it was something like 342 unexpected changes in the genome, just from this one tweak that they went and did. So, you know, we're going in blind, essentially. And so really, this is why we should be keeping this technology in the lab and keeping it, you know, if we're going to use it, well, let's be very responsible and cautious about, you know, finding out more. That's fine. But not releasing it into the environment where, you know, we have no idea what it will do with, how it will interact with soil organisms or, you know, other plants, what happens to the animals who eat GE crops, or, you know, I mean, we don't even know what it's doing to us, you know, and we are eating GE in our food, unknowingly probably, unless we eat organic all the time and homegrown. Unfortunately, there are, you know, GE ingredients sneaking into our food unlabeled, because our labelling laws are, you know, not strong enough to properly label them. And yeah, sorry, I feel like I'm organically following a river here.
Philippa,
yeah,
can you give us some ideas of like how they're sneaking into our food now? Like in what circumstances could that be happening? Could you give some examples?
Yeah, so the great news is that we currently don't grow any GE crops or animals. There's some experimental GE animals in New Zealand, but other than those, you know, New Zealand environment is GE free. So anything here, grown here or raised here, is GE free. It's the imported ingredients or imported foods where there's potentially GE, and it's often, so the law is that if something is deemed not to have any DNA in the final product, it's usually oils. So once let's say corn, if it's GE corn grown in the US or whatever, and they make some kind of oil, oh no, it might be canola, let's say canola oil, the oil is not meant to have any DNA left in it. So we can have canola oil, it might be labeled vegetable oil, and we don't know what it is. That's on our supermarket shelves, and we have no idea whether it's come from GE crops or not. And quite likely, if it's from Canada, it may well be GE. And I think the thing is also that the labelling law comes from a mindset. It comes from a mindset of, again, not a holistic mindset. It's like the consumer wants to know what's in this product, but why? Why do we want to know? It's not just about our health. It might be, I don't want to support GE canola growing in Canada because of wider things, you know? Yeah, so of course, in a lot of the ultra-processed foods on our supermarket shelves, it could be, you know, in bread, crackers, ice cream, sauces, you know, all of these sorts of things could contain GE ingredients, usually in the form of oils. There might be a lot of additives and things that are produced using GE. There might be yeasts and enzymes and so on. Yeah.
The only way to avoid them is to avoid ultra processed foods and eat organic. It's the only way to. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go back to the question box, because Sol's asking, do you know where we are regarding GE in New Zealand? I suspect we're now experimenting at crop and food and even commercially grown GE crops here now. So he's saying.
Okay, there's certainly no commercial growing of any GE crops, and there's no commercial production of GE animals in Aotearoa, New Zealand. To do that, any company or individual would have to apply to the EPA to get permission to do that, and there would be, you know, restrictions and so on. That we've got quite a, you know, some relatively stringent rules around that. There is experimentation, I'm pretty sure. I did read about GE apples being grown in containment in Auckland. I think that's Plant and Food. I mean, there's certainly a lot going on in the lab at the various universities and CRIs, you know, using different microbes and so on, bacteria and things. I don't think there's anything out of containment apart from, and Stefan may know if you're there, Stefan, the GE pine trees at Rotorua. I think they've been a spectacular failure. Stefan?
Yeah, I'm not sure that they're a spectacular failure or not. I haven't been watching them as much closely as I once did. The disturbing thing was that the EPA allowed them to actually flower. In the past, they were just growing them for, say, herbicide resistance or whatever. They allowed them to flower, and they were bagging the pollen and to stop it escaping as such, which is just, you know, if it hasn't escaped already, I'll be blowed, because they're, in my view, cavalier in their approach, the scientists up there. And but anyway, it's theoretically none are out of field trial.
Oh, I think you just dropped out again, Stefan. But thanks. Yeah, if anything's been allowed to flower like that, I mean, pine pollen can travel long distances, obviously by wind. So that's pretty disturbing, if that's true. Getting a few questions come up. Christine has asked, is Pioneer not growing GE maize? If they are, they should have, according to the law, applied to grow it. They're not growing GE maize as far as I know. Certainly they've got their signs up everywhere saying this is the variety this farmer is growing. It's our Pioneer variety, whatever number it is. I'm just wondering, I've got a few like myths that I was going to talk about, but I'm just wondering how, since we've got a reasonably intimate number of people here, whether it's a bit more led by your questions and what you want to discuss. I'm quite open to that if you would like that. I mean, I can talk about, if it's useful for people to have some information about, to counter the kind of myths that people are, I get this all the time. Oh, we need GE to feed the world, and the yields are greater. Well, actually, it's totally not true. So if you buy or if you subscribe to Organic NZ, you will see my article in there called Gee Whiz, GE Whiz, and I have very helpfully outlined very briefly some of the myths, the GE myths here. So
let's go through them, Philippa. I think that's a good idea. And we can always open up and chat after each myth, for example, if people have got questions, or we can have some time at the end to have a more broader chat if we want.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so that feed the world thing, that's one of the most common things that people say. Oh, but we need GE to feed the world. We can't do it otherwise. And, growing population and so on. Well, there's a number of reasons why that's a total myth. We can already feed the population of the world and quite a lot more with what we're currently producing. We produce enough food to feed about 14 billion people, and where are we at now? 8 or 9 billion. I'm not quite sure. But we've got more food actually than we need. A lot of it is being wasted. Up to a third of food is being wasted, particularly in rich countries. Basically, it's not being distributed equitably. So we've got a system that, where food is sitting around in certain places and not getting to the people that are starving, people that actually need it. So if people want to experiment with GE to feed the world, well, they would actually be much better putting their time and energy and money into trying to work out, some better distribution and fairer distribution to give people access to food. Also, I guess there are quite a few crops that are feeding livestock or being used as biofuels, and potentially that's they're not feeding the world per se. And if you're talking about growing, let's say, GE corn, it might not be at all for human consumption. It might be for livestock consumption or biofuels. So yeah. Anyone have a question on feeding the world? Oh, the other thing is that the feeding the world myth is based on the assumption that GE crops have greater yields, which is actually completely wrong. They don't. There's no gene for producing a greater yield. And in fact, genetic engineers are not claiming that GE produces greater yields. Just conventionally bred crops we've developed ways of producing greater yields without GE. And what the UN FAO has come out with is that, in fact, it's the small scale agroecology, they call it, like the peasant farming, essentially, that is feeding the world. Like somewhere around 70% of the world's population is being fed through, their local growing, their own growing, or their communities growing biodiverse crops, not corporate monocultures. So really, corporate monocultures are not the way to go. And GE is just part of that whole corporate monoculture mindset. Yeah, so that's feed the world. Do GE crops reduce pesticide use? Now, that's another thing that they say, the GE crops are so much more environmentally friendly. Like if you're organic and you want to reduce pesticide use, you should look at these GE crops that do so. And it's like, well, no, actually, what's happening is that you know, you're using these crops that are engineered to withstand glyphosate, let's say, like the Roundup Ready soy is engineered to withstand Roundup. So the entire field gets sprayed with Roundup, and all, you know, the weeds die off and the soy continues. But what's that doing to the soy? And then we're eating it, or animals are eating it. We're eating the animals. So, and it, in fact, it hasn't reduced pesticide use because, of course, the weeds, like nature will do, get resistant to the Roundup too after a while, you know, and you start to see new and different weeds cropping up. Then they need more or different pesticides to spray, and it just escalates. I mean, it's just not true to say that they reduce pesticide use. You're getting these super weeds that farmers are having a real big problem eliminating because they you know, they're trying to reach for more and more pesticides or a combination of pesticides to deal with them. So yeah, organic is the way. Another myth is that, oh, you know, GE is completely safe and the science is settled. You know, get with the program, you're so old-fashioned. Come on, you know, science is wonderful and they've got all these great solutions and it's fine and we've been eating it for years. Well, a number of problems with that. As I mentioned before, the gene editing, which, yes, in some ways there is some more precise knowledge than before, but in other ways, you know, we're still going in blind. It really, we have next to no knowledge about the safety of GE within ecosystems, for our own bodies. There's just so much that we don't know. So it certainly can't be said to be safe. And certainly the science isn't settled. Science is never settled. It's always asking questions and finding out more, and, you know. And of course, the science, when you talk about the science that's being published and the research that's being done on GE, because of the system we have at the moment, much of that research is being funded by the companies that own the patents, or, you know, Monsanto and Bayer now, but these companies that either already own patents or want to own patents, and that's why they're doing this sort of research. So the commercial imperative really muddies the waters here. A lot of the science that's being produced, that's being funded by these companies who stand to gain commercially, is pointing to the safety of GE, but independent research that's not influenced by corporate funders is much more likely to, you know, raise questions about the safety or point out actually, you know, the dangers. And we've had a number of scientists, such as Professor Gilles-Éric Serralini from France, and his colleagues, and scientists in the US and various places, who have been absolutely vilified and had total smear campaigns on their work. From when you dig deep, it goes back to these corporate, these companies that stand to gain from GE and have done smear campaigns. It's really, really appalling. Yes, Sol's just put in the chat there, you likely know about Dr. Huber and his GE work creating Roundup Ready crops changed his stance after seeing the huge increase in gluten intolerance, leaky gut syndrome, and celiac disease, caused in fact by glyphosate poisoning. Yes, now that's a really interesting point, Sol, thank you. Because, you know, why are so many people gluten intolerant these days? Like, where has this come from? I mean, you know, many cultures have been eating gluten for millennia. And why are we suddenly now seeing all these people that are gluten intolerant? Well, yeah, could Roundup have something to do with it? There is quite a bit of work looking at that. And indeed, I have a friend who thought she was gluten intolerant and was getting all sorts of, health symptoms, and then discovered that she could actually eat organic wheat and not get symptoms. So, yeah, interesting. And you probably know people yourselves. So, I mean, it may be that it's got, depending on the individual, it may be that the gluten intolerance has got to the point where even eating organic wheat is not going to help because it just triggers their body. But yeah, I mean, these residues, these pesticide residues, and likely not just Roundup, there'll be other residues, and they are building up, and they have synergistic effects that we just don't know because we haven't studied. Yeah, and I'm sure Alison White will be talking about that a bit more in the Dirty Dozen talk after this. Yeah. So yeah, just following on from that, there's another myth that people say, oh, well, we've been eating GE food for years, it's in our food, and we're still here, we're fine. What's wrong with it? And then, well, the glyphosate, the gluten intolerance rather, is a question. There's a lot of health problems that that are occurring. There's probably, they're multifactorial. I mean, you can't really just pinpoint it down and say, this is down to GE food that everyone's eating. Of course, there'll be a number of factors, but eating GE food could be a factor, as along with, all of the other environmental, toxins and agrochemicals and, unhealthy screen use and all of that kind of our stressful modern life. There'll be many factors, but in terms of we've been eating it for years, so it's safe argument, you just say, well, there's been no long-term testing on humans to determine the safety of GE food or otherwise. So there's no control group except for maybe the people who eat organically, but we're not being measured. It's just an amorphous experiment where GE food is out there. I mean, possibly you could see some. There might be, I guess, an epidemiological kind of broad viewpoint looking at the countries where there is more GE food available. I mean, the US will probably be a place where there is more GE food that people are eating, and comparative studies on the health of populations, comparing the US with another country like, well, what about Sikkim, which was mentioned in the last talk by Alison, the state in northwest India where they've gone completely organic will be really interesting to see the health. But it's quite hard to measure that because there'll be so many different factors, I guess. So, yeah. Yeah, another comment here, the rise in autoimmune conditions could also be linked to glyphosate use. Yeah. There's so many health, we've got a health crisis, and I think here in Aotearoa New Zealand, we've sort of been so focused on kind of the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, the hospital waiting list and all of this kind of thing, which obviously if you're on a waiting list, that's really pertinent. But I guess the whole organic thing is all about preventive health and primary health care, looking after yourself by eating good, healthy, organic food. And so trying not to get those conditions, autoimmune or you know, diabetes and heart disease and all of those sorts of things, cancers. Yeah. Another question here. Which countries are the biggest players using it around the world, using GE? Well, I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, because there's a lot of knowledge here in this Zoom. I think that there's still the big 4 crops that are the dominant GE crops, and that is canola, corn or maize, soy, and cotton. And cotton is not just for the fibre, but also cottonseed oil is in human food and in stock feed, I think. So the places where those crops are grown, so the US, Canada, to an extent Australia, I think China's growing GE cotton, correct me if I'm wrong. I think there's GE cotton being grown in some of the like Kazakhstan and those sorts of areas. Yeah. So it's still, look out for those ingredients. I don't think there's GE soy in Australia. If you have soy milk, I think it's still GE free in Australia, but let me know. I know they have GE canola in Australia. That organic farmer, Steve Marsh, in Western Australia, he was growing organic canola, and the moratorium was lifted in Western Australia for growing GE crops, and gradually there, you know, was some GE canola farmers growing it, GE canola, and unfortunately, due to a weather event, some GE canola seed got blown or flooded, I think, I'm not sure, onto Steve Marsh's farm and sprouted, and he lost his organic certification. So that, you know, it's really hard. You can't, most of these crops you can't contain, you know, because either the pollen or the seed is going to, you know, it's going to cross-pollinate with other GE-free, you know, counterpart plants, or the seed can get spread by wind, by animals, and weather events. Yeah. Oh yes, Alison's just chimed in. Brazil and Argentina are major GE growers, and a lot of that rainforest being cut down for GE soy as well as beef. It's not just animals, it's the GE soy, which is being aerial sprayed with glyphosate. Huge plantations. I understand New Zealand actually imports GE soy stock feed from Argentina. So Brazil as well. South Africa would be another player. They've got GE maize. In fact, I think one of the only products on New Zealand supermarket shelves that does declare on the label that it's a GE product is a particular kind of cornmeal from South Africa. And it does actually say it's GE. But otherwise, you know, you wouldn't know from the labelling whether Stephen.
Hi. I may cut out again, but one thing that's worth noting for everybody is that the GE labelling that is regulated in New Zealand, and things should be, most things, apart from food additives that have been genetically engineered, but main foods are meant to be labelled. And that is one of the only examples, as you say. But our authorities, our Ministry of Primary Industries, hasn't done a proper survey of genetically engineered foods since 2003. And so they are willfully ignoring the fact that probably a lot of bread in New Zealand. It's got soy in it, will be genetically engineered soy because it's the cheapest. And so basically, unless it's organic, any soy from the Americas, north, right, and the south, it has to be very, very suspect, and this should be considered to be GE. So, it's just that, organics is the way to go, because you cannot be confident of avoiding it, because our own regulator is willfully ignoring its own regulations.
Yeah, thanks for that, Stephen. Yep. You probably know heaps more that you should be doing this. This seminar is really great to get your expertise. Yeah. I just had a thought and I've lost it now. About the GE soy. Never mind. I'll carry on what I thought, because we've only really got about a quarter of an hour left. And what I thought I'd introduce towards the end here now is, okay, I hope I've, given you some idea, if you didn't know already, that, GE is at best suspect, and at worst actually actively a bad thing for our health, the environment, and many other things, social, cultural considerations as well. But it's like, well, okay, where do we go from here? And that is a really big question, because what I find is that the landscape has shifted significantly over the last 20 years since the moratorium on growing GE crops or using GE in the outdoor environment in New Zealand. The moratorium was lifted in 2003. And yes, we haven't had commercial open air growing and raising of animals since then. However, the proponents of GE have just kept on pushing all these, pushing and pushing and pushing, and all the universities just teach it like, this is great stuff. The students think, wow, we can do this or that, and it's really the best thing since sliced bread. We can do all these amazing things, and what's wrong with GE? And so for a lot of young people, they're not getting the messages. They're not getting these messages. Maybe they're not understanding that they should at the very least stop and think. Is this a good idea? What are the wider implications? They're just getting, they're doing science, and the science teachers are going, wow, we can do these really cool tweaks with gene editing, and we can get some great results. And that's what I would like to address. And if anyone has any ideas about how we can, I guess, get out to a more mainstream, get out to a wider group of people, younger people particularly, talk with them, ask questions. I think also Māori, there's been to date mostly a very sceptical, if not downright rejection of GE from many Māori. And there's a lot of cultural considerations there that Māori report that they, that GE is, completely culturally unsafe. It destroys or whakapapa, that kinship with the natural world, the Māori, the life force of a species, a living being, that sort of thing. And I think that we need to widen this conversation, and I'm welcome your ideas as to how we continue, because GE proponents are always saying we need to have the conversation. Like, yeah, we're having it. We've been having it. Yeah. So where to from here?
Philippa, can I just stop you there and ask a question? I had a couple of questions from Instagram, which you've kind of touched a little bit on already, but it's kind of on the same theme. So we had a question from someone who was asking, if there is any up-and-coming legislation allowing its use in NZ. I know there's been more talk about it, and the proponents are pushing regulation change. So could you give us a bit of an update on what's happening from a beehive perspective?
I think other people may be more familiar with that than I am. I don't know that there's any proposed legislation change, but there has been in the past a challenge as to what the definition of GE or genetic modification in the law is in Aotearoa New Zealand. And I think it was back in 2014, actually, the Sustainability Council successfully refuted that challenge and said, and that there was a legal ruling that gene editing is genetic engineering or genetic modification, as the law describes it. But globally, there's a really big push to deregulate gene editing techniques. So that's the likes of CRISPR, zinc finger nuclease, TALENs. There are different names for these newer techniques. So I think in the UK, they've just actually passed a law exempting gene editing from GE laws. Do other people know, Stefan? Or I believe that's gone through.
Yeah, I think that did pass, unfortunately, and it was a bit of a disappointment with the new king who's coming, who's having his celebrations or whatever today, but who's definitely opposed to genetically engineering, and yet, just like our Governor General signs off on laws regardless of their actual personal belief. I'll just drop in that anecdote, saying that is Charles's day today, I guess, whether you're a royalist or not. But we presented, or I did, along with Seega Mason, to Charles many years ago, a Soil and Health original magazine, a copy of, because he's a patron of the Soil Association in Britain. And I purposely asked him at that time what his views were on GE, because I knew what they were. And he thought it would be a definite mistake for New Zealand to go down the path of genetic engineering. And I know that he held that because later, when I was a Member of Parliament, I was able to see him again at a reception when he and Camilla came one time, and he certainly held to it. But one of his sons at another reception saying, "Oh, well, Dad, I don't necessarily hold the same views as Dad." So I think we'd be grateful for this iteration of the monarchy if you do. I'm not a monarchist, but rather than maybe the next one. Anyway, just an anecdote. Cheers.
Yeah. Thanks, Stefan. Yes. So I think they deregulated gene editing in the US as well. I'm not quite sure where it's at, but certainly in New Zealand, I don't think there certainly hasn't been a law change to that effect, and I think it would be stringently opposed. However, depending on what happens after the election, I don't know whether it would be a major or not.
There's continual pressure to change the HASNO Act, the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act, and so you can be sure that the big agribusiness and the life sciences people will continue the pressure to change that, to allow these technologies. It's just it's an international pressure, and just the more we can push back in New Zealand, the better.
Yeah, great. Yes, and that's so important, because I think we're quite a small country, and we have actually managed to be quite strong in our GE freeness, which I think we need to give ourselves a pat on the back for being staunch on that, and also if we can, I think Aotearoa New Zealand remaining GE free is a market advantage as well. We've got to push that to people who might be exporting or who think more in economic terms. I'm just reading this comment from Satori. Perhaps that's the way we can tap into the younger population with passing on this info. The Māori, the spiritual perspective, not just the scientific perspective on these things. There's a lot of wisdom among the youth regarding spirituality and what is morally wrong. I think that's really important, because so often, when I get into an argument, I don't like these arguments, but when people are really just talking about the science of it and even saying, well, you don't have a science background, so you don't know anything about it, sort of thing. And then I just try and broaden it out and go, well, it's, yes, science obviously is a big part, but there is ethics, philosophy, social considerations, cultural considerations, and of course, environmental. Although just a quick word about the word environmental, I can't remember where I read it, but when you use the word environment, it's often people have a kind of quite amorphous idea of the environment. But when you talk about ecosystems, obviously that conjures up a much more holistic view about all the different parts of ecosystems interacting together. And so I try to use the word ecosystems a bit more than the word environment. Yeah. Anyway, I digress. So, great point, Satori. I think, we need to be saying, just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. And bringing in those ethical and philosophical questions. Yeah, thank you. Right, a couple of other questions. Can you share some info about GE ryegrass? What would the introduction of it do to the, what would the introduction of GE do to the organic sector in Aotearoa? Okay, so GE ryegrass, this is something that has been experimented on in the US and Australia, and I think PGG Wrights and Ag Research have been doing that research. Someone can correct me if that's wrong. It's being touted as a solution to climate change. Some people are saying this GE ryegrass, if the animals eat it, they will produce less methane. Now, it's possible that that's true, but even if it is, again, it's a silver bullet type mentality. It's a very narrow solution. Instead of thinking, GE ryegrass can, let our animals produce less methane. Let's think of the wider context, and there's many ways that we could reduce methane without having to have a experiment with a grass that we don't know what effect it's going to have on the ecosystems, on the soil organisms, on other plants, on the animals, on and then cross-pollination. Obviously, grasses are wind-pollinated. And then, if we release GE ryegrass in the open environment in New Zealand, it would pretty much soon spread everywhere. Might take a while to cross the Cook Strait, but this is not something we should be fooling around with. So certainly it would devastate organics if GE ryegrass got out. And it potentially could devastate pastoral farming anyway. Philippa,
the GE ryegrass has been experimented on for many, many years now, and at huge taxpayer expense. And what it's, I think, is really about, and it's is producing seed with intellectual property that those that would market it, which is more than just ag research, it's PGG Wrightson and others that aim to make mega money out of that. And you're right, it would be contaminating for everybody else. And it's the thin end, a very thick end of a wedge for GE in New Zealand. It would be definitely the gene out of the bottle as such, if that got out. But the field trials are in the US because the restrictions are strong enough here at the moment that the field trials can't happen here because of the high risk. And once again, I'd say the scientists are cavalier in their approach. Some of the same scientists that have been involved around that were involved with the GE brassicas issue at Lincoln many years ago that Claire and I discovered and found that they were allowing some wilding brassicas to actually have gone through to flower very briefly because we stopped it. And that had to be, in fact, they had to dig the soil out and deep bury it. But they're cowboys and cowgirls. And so the ryegrass is an ongoing thing. It's an ongoing pressure. Farmers are being sold that it's a wonderful thing, but there are great alternatives.
Yeah, there are heaps of alternatives. I mean, reducing stock numbers for a start. We're obviously intensive dairy farming is way too hard on the environment, on the ecosystems. And mixed pasture species, you know, all sorts of other things can reduce methane emissions. So yeah, thanks for that, Stephen. Really appreciate it. And also your mention of Claire Bleakley from GE Free New Zealand, President of GE Free New Zealand. Both of you, Stephen Browning and Claire Bleakley, you've done such fantastic work in the GE Free space for many years, and I really take my hat off to you both. Thank you. So yeah, I guess we're coming up to closing shortly, and I just want to just bring it back to that holistic viewpoint about GE, and it's not just about the science, and I think that's the contrast between the organic holistic mindset and also a reverence for nature, which Noel Josephson was talking about, you know, our connection to nature in the talk before, our interconnectedness with everything and our reverence for nature. It's we cannot, I mean, if we are arrogant, we will be there will be a consequence to that. We must be humble in the ways that we live on this planet. And I think that's, I guess, just summing up the difference in mindset. And I'd really like to see conversations around GE and organics that go into the different ways of thinking and how what consequences that has for us, for the planet, the ways we live. So anyway, I hope that was interesting, and thank you for everyone for participating and contributing and all your questions and expertise. So, and go out and get the magazine, Organic NZ. It's a great read, or, you know, buy it for your friend or family member if they can't afford it or whatever, and spread the word.
Thank you, Philippa. Thanks so much for that, for
sharing. Philippa.
For those, we've got our next session up is sharing biodynamics. We've got Kathy Tate-Jamieson, I think, who's online already. Are you here, Kathy? And Katrina Wolf, I think, is Katrina here as well? Talking about the biodynamic conference, which is in literally 2 weeks' time up in Fielding. They're going to have some chats about what's going to be happening there. So please stay online. We'd love to see you there as well. We've got 2 more sessions for the day, and then the second session is Claire talking, sorry, not Claire, we've got Alison talking about the NZ's Dirty Dozen, so talking about pesticides in our food. So please stay online, and I'm going to pop everyone in the waiting room now and have a quick 15-minute break, and we'll see you very, very soon. Thanks, Philippa, and thanks for everyone for coming.
Thank you.